If you find you're unsettled listening today, reach out to a trusted friend or go to tradespodcast.com and click on resources.
We are men in the trades, forging health in the drug poisoning crisis. This is
Off the Clock Toolbox Talk.
Welcome to the Season 4 sampler of Off the Clock Toolbox Talk, a curious mix of Season 4 clips together with some tunes to keep your day going. Up first, we have Anthony's story.
I was home, went for a tear, about 14 days, and I used to make quite a bit of money, and I spent all my money in those 14 days. I got the call, you're come back up, and I'm like, okay. So I started driving, and I'm like, oh, I better grab some other things to keep me awake on that drive.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember falling asleep in Golden on the highway, going 120.
Oh, wow!
I bounced off the
highway.
Yeah, I bounced off the center guardrail, woke myself up, hit my head against the window, and then I was like, okay, better have a little nap. So I had a nap, and then I went off the road 2 more times before I got back to Alberta. And I was just tired,
Yeah.
I just drove too long or whatever, party too hard.
Clearly.
Yeah, and just a wreck. And anyways, this one foreman I didn't know at the time, but he used to be an alcoholic, and he was in the program, and he was giving me a hard time, and I'm like, why are you giving me a hard time, man? We're all like this, and I was thinking in my head, right? But he had like a soft spot for me, I think, a little bit, and he gave me a chance, and I still fucked it up. But I remember that he was trying to. I look back at it. He was trying to help me, but I didn't take it. Oh, I know better. I'm just gonna go back home and I'll find another job or whatever. Because I got hot-headed out there or something, and I got sent home, and I called him like, hey man, I don't know what's going on. Like, I almost got into it with this big guy, and they sent me home. And I'm like, he was instigator. He was cut me off on the highway or something. I was late for work. I was being a dick.
Yeah.
So it was all his fault, right?
Totally.
Yeah. And so he's like, oh, Anthony, I heard you're doing this and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, well, no, and he's like, okay, well, take the day off and we'll try again tomorrow. He gave me a chance there, and it was starting to get rainy season. You can't work in the rain. So, we got 14 days off. I'm like, okay, I'm going back home. So I went back home again, and that was it. That was the last time, 2016. I couldn't make it back. I spent all the money. I was like crying. I was crying because I was alone, but I didn't want to be alone, but I had to use a loan. I don't know. It's very bad. The things that were going through my head weren't good. It's like, why am I even here? And at this point, I have a 6-month-old son. I skipped over that. I have a 6-month-old son that I had with the relationship that I burnt down. The relationship, it was not a healthy relationship, but I was trying to hang on. Didn't start out healthy. We were using together, and it was gross. But the child was brought into the world in that, my son's 6 months old. I was like, I got to do something different here. I was by myself in my bedroom. I was high, and I was thinking, like, I don't want to be alone anymore. And I'm at home by myself in Kelowna, waiting to get a call to go back up to work. And I finally broke down. I was like, I need to get some help. I didn't know at the time, but I just called a family member that I thought that might be able to help. And it was my auntie. She said, yeah, there's a place down the road from us in Duncan on the island here. And I was like, I didn't know what to think. I was just like, okay, I'm going to get help, and I'll just go back doing the same life I was doing. Right. I just won't use drugs. I won't be doing heroin. I went to treatment, and but I had a deadline. I was like, well, November 23rd, I got to be out of here because another job's happening. So the counselor right away starts laughing. Oh, you think so? Hey, I'm like, no, I know so. That's when I got to go. Oh
Gotta get to
man,
that work.
so delusional. I'm like 6 days in. I just got out of the detox bed. Like, I'm like, I was kicking holes in the wall because it was not nice.
Yeah.
No.
And, yeah, I told her where I'm going.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
Believe me, I know best. Can't you
yeah,
see the history of
yeah,
great decisions and how much I know?
yeah. And then finally, after 21 days in, I got about 6 hours of sleep finally. Instead of an hour a night for the first 21 days. And
Yeah.
then things started to change. I was like, okay, well, maybe that's not a healthy place for me to be going after this. The outside world was scary again, and anyways, I got out. I went to the second stage living, and still focused on recovery, still thawing out from those years of
Yep.
use. And I got a job in Bear Mountain laying pipe.
That was Anthony's story from season 4 of Off the Clock Toolbox Talk. Up next is Constructive Coercion Part 1, a fascinating conversation with Dr. Jeremy Milloy, exploring how violence became integrated into construction culture, ultimately contributing to a workplace where harm to workers became expected.
Violence was happening in these workplaces and used in all different ways. And particularly, I found the biggest things causing violence were things like, sexism, racism, and just changes in the labor process. The harder they were pushing people, and in the 60s and 70s, especially here in Detroit, Chrysler started pushing people really hard to compete with Japanese imports, to compete with German imports, to compete with the rest of the big three. And they didn't have as much capital as some of the other companies. So the way they had to push it wasn't through new technology, it was by pushing the people they had in the workplaces to get more cars out and hiring more supervisors to yell at them more and intimidate them more. And that created a pressure cooker where people were opting to use violence all over the place. And so that really instilled in me, it's not just what's inside people, it's what we put around people and the choices that they have and the supports that they have and what life looks like to them that influences their choices. I always say to people, Chrysler didn't just hire a bunch of bad people in the late 1960s, right? They were going through resumes saying, have you ever, had an assault charge or whatever? They were putting people into situations where it was really likely that they would choose violence as a result of what was going on around them.
And
so maybe
my mind, because this
Yeah.
is so much like the construction industry and, all of the
100%.
same tactics of, hire more people to yell at them more and stuff. And I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, that's exactly the same tools that's used in the construction, or at least it has been up until now. It's changed. It's starting to change now.
And my mind jumps to, like many people do when we talk about workplace violence, my mind jumps to the idea of somebody going postal or bringing a gun to work or some sort of violence around that. But we're talking about a lot more things here that fall under the umbrella of workplace violence, right?
Absolutely. And one of the things that really stood out to me that was really startling, shocking even, was how many things, there was one or two shootings that I found in the records. I went through every record I could for Chrysler in Detroit and Windsor from 1950 to 75. And how many other like things that we would consider like really severe, people hitting each other with a pipe or a crowbar or a stabbing, something like that. But like I was always cognizant from, just knowing how things work and my own experience with violence and talking to other people about their workplace experiences, that there's so much that would never make it into a grievance, never make it into a report.
Right.
And that could be, things like a beating, or it could be just, like what we would call a microaggression now, like what happened to the person I talked to in Windsor, being followed around, having comments made to you. There's a whole spectrum, and
paying your dues, right?
and a lot of it's considered paying your dues.
Yeah.
The term that would come up over and over again in my mind, and because I saw it in the records and in talking to people, was part of the job.
right.
It was part of the job, and
Just normalized.
it was just like what we accept as part of the job, and what changes in life when we cross onto a factory or a job site. It's like it's never left me that thinking that like the rules just become different, and people get away with things that if you did them, on a street corner or in a restaurant or in a park, like it would be
Arrested.
completely unacceptable.
Yeah.
Yep.
But we tolerate
100%.
that because it's supposed to come with the job. It's supposed to come with the paycheck.
That was from Constructive Coercion, Part 1. Up next is the new PPE featuring C. Michael Kinsella's story.
But there's a price. Like there's a price we pay. Every single one of us is going to age faster. We're going to deal with the injuries like pro athletes. It's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, we get the same injuries as pro athletes without any of the glory, right?
You're right.
I can't count the amount of concussions I have. Usually I shave my head. You probably can't see it, but right here, I got 12 staples across the top of my head from a Burt bar. I remember like walking up from stripping a parquet and walking up just like, hey, somebody give me some first aid. And my buddy turns around, looks at me, and I'm like, oh, is it bleeding? He's like, look at your shirt. I'm just covered in blood. Yeah. So I go to the lumber store to buy lumber. And the guy at the lumber store is like, we go to the walk-in and they're like, oh, it's like a 4-hour wait. I'm like, oh, fuck. All right, I'm going to go to the lumber store and I'll come back. So go to the lumber store, and the guy at the lumber store finally gives me some first aid. And I think it's like the coolest story in the world, and I'm so cool. And then later it's like, so concussions are real. Yeah. So that's a thing. And you're right. Like we wear the injuries like badges. We wear the long hours like badges. Yeah. And we also wear I was out all night drinking and I'm still here in the morning like badges. Totally. And, I was doing rails all night while I laid out this fucking slab like badges. Yeah. And that's where a lot of the problems come from, right? Like we encourage each other to go further and further with everything, whether it's working harder, working more hours, drinking more, smoking more, etc. Totally. And in today's world, it doesn't really work out too well. Like, I always tell the guys it's like a little joke. It's not your foreman's cocaine out there anymore, right? No, it's not. It's not your foreman's coke. Like, you need to be more careful. You need to be more on it. You probably shouldn't be high operating machines. Yeah, well, that's the thing we don't talk a lot about, right? Is what's going on, during business hours. Because let's face it, people aren't overdosing, during business hours. Where the accidents, and the suicides and the overdose, they're happening off the job site. But I knew countless guys, and myself included, who
Used to have to, take some of the pain away in the morning. Used to have to bump up a little bit to get through the afternoon because you weren't living healthy. Like we weren't eating right, we weren't drinking right, we weren't sleeping
Yeah.
right, and it was kind of like everybody's doing it, right?
Yeah, everybody's doing it, and I do agree with
Normalized.
you. Sorry, yeah, everyone is doing it, and I do agree with you. Like 99% of the fatalities aren't happening on site. Obviously,
Yeah.
we all know that. The thing that I'm always concerned about is the fact that the death toll in our demographic is constantly going up. Meanwhile, it's getting more and more expensive to live here,
Yeah.
and people are working more and more hours. And there's also a shortage of trades workers coming up, which will
Absolutely.
lead to even more hours, even more people injured on site working anyway. I don't know any tradesmen that aren't working Saturdays.
Accidents happen because people aren't paying attention, and people don't pay attention because they're overtired. There's a lot going on to there just to unpack. But like I say, the biggest mortality, thing affecting mortality of construction workers is suicide and overdose. More than job site accidents, more than anything. And we're spending all the best hours of our life on job sites. And so, although I'm not looking to cast blame, I'm just looking for solutions. And if we have these men for 40, 50, 60 hours a week, how are we taking care of them in a way that they know that they're supported and they don't have to go and feel alone or use alone or do any of these things? Like, how do we start leading them into better places?
That was the new PPE, which you can check out for yourself at thenewppe.org. Next up is 100 Goodbyes, featuring psychologist Dr. Nicole Anders, who lost her brother Cody to drug poisoning.
It was so challenging to work as a PTSD therapist while I was in such deep trauma. Mm-hmm. And even though I have crossed over some type of, threshold with at least the trauma of my brother, the trauma of just the opiate crisis that we're dealing with, and I work with combat veterans and sexual trauma, and it's just so much. We're just human too, right? Like first responders, we just are. And I think that is another piece. I was really nervous in some sense to publish the book and let it be public and maybe have my patients read it, or, my boss or whoever. Because I was trained very psychodynamically, which in the framework of psychodynamic psychotherapy, it's very much, you need to be neutral. You need to be a blank slate so that the patient that you're working with can kind of use projection and use you however they want. But I just was trained, and don't bring your personal life into your work. And I still think some of that is important, but I was afraid of what people might think, that I was swearing in my book, or that I was angry, or that I, had done things that I regretted, or I was shameful of, or that I wasn't over it yet, or whatever it was. And so, I sat with that a lot and processed it a lot. And when I decided to release it to the world, I said, okay, well, people can just view me as human. And I think that's kind of like circling back to what you said. How are we dealing with it? How are we receiving it? How are we being traumatized, dealing with trauma? We're just humans, with our own toolboxes, trying to navigate it. I don't know that we have the magic answers like people think we do, which is part of also the transparency in the book. I'm just a human going through the nonlinear stages of grief myself, trying to pull myself together to not cry today at work so I could hold space for somebody else. And I think self-care, comes a lot into that, and our own insight and things like that. There's ways to manage that. And I'm happy to talk about how I manage it. But I think being in a helping profession and being vicariously traumatized very often, we need to look at that.
I'm kind of curious, I mean, you have this clinical knowledge and training as a professional, so you have an understanding of grief before your brother passes away. I'm kind of curious, how did your professional knowledge match with the real life experience? And what were the major differences or things that kind of might have blindsided you there?
Yeah, great question. So my mom died when I was 14. So I had a big grief experience before I had any professional knowledge. So it's kind of almost like it was grief, professional knowledge, grief, more professional knowledge. But both of those grief experiences were very different from each other and from other grief experiences I've had, like losing grandparents and whatnot. I remember when Cody died, and I had this realization of how difficult it was going to. Not only did I not want him to be gone because I loved him and want him in my life forever, I knew how hard grief and the grieving process was going to be because I went through it and I'd studied it and I sat with it. And I remember saying to my husband and probably to friends, I can't do this again. I don't want to do this again. It was like I'd gone through the ringer and I knew what that felt like and looked like. And I also knew that the only way out was through.
Yep.
And so that was where this paradox came, where it was, I could avoid this. I could start using substances myself. It's never been my to, but I could, throw myself in work. I could do all the things that we do, or I could go through it. And that would be the healthiest option. And even choosing that consciously, there was days when I still avoided. There was days when I still didn't want to be there.
And you were pregnant at the time, correct?
Oh my goodness, yes. I was very pregnant when Cody died. I was 7 months pregnant.
Yeah.
7 months pregnant. And that was a whole nother element, right? And then I had a baby for the first time. So there's a lot going on. And I think that's the part of what had me write this book was I realized that first year was a lot of chaos. It was a newborn baby. A lot of things were going on that I just wanted to focus and say, like, let me really feel my feeling. And I think the clinical knowledge helped me because I knew that grief wasn't linear. So I think at least I had a guide, and I knew, and I read a lot of other books. Like I read other people's books to help me, and then my book helps others. So it's a really nice thing. I listened to podcasts. I really tried to understand it. And some days my clinical knowledge helped me, and other days I was just a human and nothing could help me,
That was 100 Goodbyes. Next up is James's story.
And during that time, I had a specialist appointment because nobody was telling me what was wrong.
Oh, wow.
And so, like my foot, of course, I could barely stand on it. I phoned the specialist and I said, can I get in earlier because I'm in so much pain? And his receptionist said if it was that bad, he would have seen you already. So It was 6 months before I seen him. And when I walked in, he said, where's your cast? I said, I don't know what you're talking about. He said,
Unreal.
well, you should have been in an air cast this whole time for the past 6 months. I said, did you tell my doctor that? Did you tell? I
Yeah.
said, I phone your office. I get kind of chewed out and, made feel bad that I'm trying to get in early. So it was a nightmare, and it took over a year to find out the extent of the damage. And I'd shattered my heel, I broke my leg, I broke my hip, and I had a bulging disc in my back.
Goodness.
And so, and you go to a doctor, and you're allowed to talk about one thing.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, well, I'm in a lot of pain. It feels like I'm stepping on an ice pick every time I take a step. And my back is killing me. And doctor says, well, you're limping pretty badly, so that makes sense. And it made sense to me,
Mhm.
but let's look into it. Well, that's a separate appointment.
Yeah.
And when you're on, well, at the time I was fighting for workers' comp and trying to travel up and down, the cost of fuel, everything else. Because at the time, I think the fuel had gone crazy, or maybe not
Oh,
quite
yeah.
yet, but it was up around 2 or higher than 2 for a while there. And so it was hard to make ends meet.
Mhm.
And getting cut off and then having to get a lawyer to fight to get me back on, and
Unbelievable.
the list went on and on and on. I went a year and a half where I fought with WorkSafe, and they finally back paid me a year and a half wages because I proved that things
Yeah.
were messed up.
Mhm.
And even then, they completely denied my back. They said your back it could have happened anytime. But when I seen their doctors, they said, well, if you fell to that from that height, and I'm a big guy, so if you're going to shatter your heel, break your leg, break your hip, your back is going to get messed up too.
Yeah.
The only thing they covered was my heel and my knee, which was never
Unreal.
on the claim ever. My knee was never on the claim. So I ended up with, I think, 4 different claims or something like that, trying to get it covered. And at that point, they're just like, deny, deny, deny. And I went through as far as I could without getting a lawyer. And at the time, to get a lawyer, nobody would talk to me without a $5,000 retainer down. So what are you left with?
Yeah.
You're screwed.
Yeah.
So and at that point, well, that was the start of it. And I was off for just over 6 years and fighting, trying to advocate for myself, going through absolute hell with my mental health. I was living in a camper full of mold and mice and everything else.
Wow.
And, I had people that were saying they wanted to help me and get me into a better living situation. And then all of a sudden they change their mind and say, there's a lot of people that have it a lot worse than you. So maybe you should start being thankful. And I'm sitting there going, okay. Like
Wow.
I was at a
Wow.
point where I was ready to end my life at all
Yeah.
kinds of, at
Yep.
any moment.
Yep.
And the only reason I got out of that camper is my grandma had died and she left money to my mom, who's been gone for over 20 years. So lucky enough, my sister and I got that money. So I was able to put it towards getting a fifth wheel that a buddy of mine sold to me and gave me a good deal. That's the only reason I got out of it. So even
Wow.
now I'm still living in that, and it's not the best
Yeah.
living, but you deal with it the way you can, and
Yeah.
Yeah.
that's how I'm dealing with now. And we all know the cost of living out here. I mean, to
Yeah.
go even get an apartment, it's
Yeah.
pretty much
It's
one of my
insane.
paychecks. Like, it's crazy.
James, as I'm hearing you tell your story, and I'm hearing lots about physical pain and like breakages and injury and everything else, but as you're having to fight for your basic rights that you've paid into as a worker and all this stuff, I'm hearing emotional pain and emotional
Oh,
injury on
brutal.
top of that. And, we usually just like, oh, yeah, that's mental health or whatever. But the pain and I first heard Gabor Mate say this in a short film, and he said, your body doesn't know the difference between physical pain and emotional pain. So if someone stabbed you in the leg and you got a brain scan, your certain part of your brain would be lit up showing that you're in pain. And if somebody broke your heart or rejected you somehow, like somebody that was important to you, and you got a brain scan, exactly the same part of your brain is lit up. Your brain doesn't know the difference between physical pain and emotional pain. And so it's like a double injury, and we just don't validate those things and understand the impact of those things. If you're having to fight for, like, it feels like you're fighting for your very existence, then you can't, like, you're both, your physical and your emotional are injured. And I believe that the spiritual realm was also involved with both of those things too. And then you get spiritually injured as well. And that's what creates that devastation of like, what the fuck do I do now? And then the only options, that's where the brain begins to think about things related to suicide and self-harm, because you just don't have any personal resources left. That was James's story. You can find James at painbc.ca. Next up is Constructive Coercion Part 2, exploring how the construction industry came to be a primary battlefield of the overdose crisis.
There's this huge bet made on identifying and intervening in problematic substance use through the workplace and through workplace relationships. And by the mid to late 90s, you have the dawning of another opioid problem, an opioid epidemic that y'all are working on, that is centered in the bodies of working class people, right? Like to the point that it will always stay with me, learning that Purdue Pharma, when they were doing the initial marketing plan for Oxy, they went and listed all the US counties that had the highest rate of workplace injury. And they said, well, that's incredible. Where we put our money.
Wow. 80s, like they came like wildfire through the industry.
Yeah. Yeah. And because I mean, that was targeted. And no, I don't think anyone's really put those two things together and say, well, we made this huge bet that we would be able to identify and treat these problems through the workplace. And actually these problems, were kind of reinforced through the bodies of workers, and how many people have ended up losing their lives or losing significant parts of their lives, or having massive negative health outcomes because of injury suffered through work because of substance use disorder picked up through a workplace environment. So I'm kind of trying to put those two pieces beside each other and say, what happened?
Yeah.
Just thinking,
countless guys I know, their introduction to opioids was 80s. I mean, that was like, it was both normalized the use of, but also the abuse of is still to this day, like whereas the stimulants and stuff are an open secret, the opioids are still this thing that people don't talk about. But that idea of painkillers is very common.
Right.
Yeah. I'm thinking about the workers are needing to be on opiates or painkillers or whatever just to get through. And then I'm also now thinking of, the guys up at corporate office who are trying to create these huge profits. and they're also on opioids or cocaine or stimulants or whatever it is to work to get themselves through, because everybody's pushing themselves so hard. And this is where it kind of comes back to capitalism again. And it's not that you have to be, you're a socialist and you're a capitalist or anything like that, but it's just like, why are we doing this to ourselves? That was Constructive Coercion Part 2. You can find all the Off the Clock Toolbox Talk episodes at tradespodcast.com. Off the Clock Toolbox Talk has been a Fraser House Society project, executive produced and co-hosted by Karen Jansen, managed by Delan Young on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples. Production of this material has been made in part through a financial contribution from Health Canada. The views expressed herein do not necessarily reflect the views of Health Canada or Fraser House Society. The content of this podcast is conversation between people with living experience and should not be taken as professional advice. Know someone with chronic pain that just isn't getting better? Check out painbc.ca. Help save lives. Go to tradespodcast.com and click on the link under Enter to win a $200 grocery card. When you fill out the survey, you help us understand what's working and what's not. Each survey for each episode listened to is a separate entry. Information collected is for survey purposes only and is not shared. Help us, help you.